Okay, so post-editing Ranger here. Obviously, this video went a lot longer than I intended. What I would recommend doing, honestly, is go watch Cammy's video first. This is, of course, us talking about his video about the future of Destiny 2. And then after that, you can come back and, you're welcome to just listen to this one, right? Just throw it up in the background, kind of like a podcast or something. That's totally fine. It's a long one, but I think it turned out pretty well. I actually quite enjoyed making this and, talking about some of these topics, but for now, let's get back to the video. What's going on, Guardians? So, given the current situation this week with Destiny and Bungie and all that, I had wanted to do a video kind of talking about the future of Destiny, but CammyCakes did a video in that style, and he basically covered everything that I had wanted to cover. So instead of doing my own, I wanted to do kind of a, with Cammy's permission, by the way, do a reaction to his video. And then afterwards, we're going to give some of our own thoughts, add on to some of what he's saying a little bit, just do that sort of thing. This is more of a partial reaction. I'm not going to go through the entire nearly 30-minute video. I'm just going to just edit it down to the parts that I thought were, the most relevant to me and what, I look for in the game. And then afterwards, I'm going to talk about some particular things that I would like to see happen, as well as certain things that have been pain points for me. By the way, this video is almost completely unscripted, so I apologize if I trip over my words at all. Much like everyone else, of course, I am really depressed about what happened over at Bungie. I feel awful for the devs who were laid off, but that will be a topic, possibly for another video. We'll just have to see how we're feeling about that. And also, like everyone else, I am, of course, very concerned for the final shape and what's going to happen there. But to be honest, I'm more concerned about what comes after the final shape and where Destiny goes after that DLC, if it continues at all past the episodes that they already have planned, so on and so forth. So for now, let's just jump into the video.
Moving on. Here are some hard pills to swallow about Destiny in its current form. The game is wide-reaching, but shallow. It appeals to multiple subgenres of FPS, MMO, RPG, looter, etc. It appeals to multiple player archetypes, again, casual, hardcores, everything in between. It tries not to be too specific for either and struggles to separate focus per activity and instead makes a homogeneous experience that most can approach, but not all can find fun with.
Okay, just very briefly on that. This is one thing that I have noticed myself throughout the years in Destiny and something that I very much agree with. Destiny 2 has a ton of variety in what you can do in the game, and this is something of a double-edged sword. There's a lot to do, but a lot of it feels pretty shallow, especially on the PvE side. On top of that, and this is of course coming from the weapons guy, so to speak, it also makes balancing the game really tough because you have these two sandboxes, PvE and PvP, merged, and there's a lot of overlap there that can make balancing, very frustrating. It makes balance, a lot of times very scuffed, and it, honestly, it obviously makes it very tough for the devs. The upside to this variety, of course, is that there's a lot to do. So you're having a bad PvP day, well, you can go do some PvP. Having a rough PvE day or not enjoying PvE, you could hop into PvP. Not really feeling either, Gambit kind of exists. So while I do enjoy the sort of variety that Bungie brings to the table with Destiny, I really think, again, especially on the PvE side, there needs to be a lot more depth to it, a lot more things to make it interesting and engaging, and for sure a lot more challenge, especially on the endgame part of PvE.
Next thing is, new additions to the game are not always permanent additions, nor are they always expanded upon or planned to be expanded upon.
Okay, so I'm going to stop again here just very briefly. One perfect example of this is Dares of Eternity, right? And that is something that I'm going to bring up after we finish the video here. But Dares is the perfect example of this, and I think I have a potentially easy solution to make it better and get people interested in Dares again, but we'll save that to the end of the video. Moving on.
At a certain point with power creep, we got so powerful that the only way PvE enemies could kill us is by knocking us off the cliff. Otherwise, we had so much damage resistance, it was just impossible to do anything. And we're pretty much back there. This was a couple years ago. So what is sunsetting? This was the solution to power creep, and it's by means of making previously obtained gear unusable in modern content. In concept, it was always a good idea considering the alternatives and limitations, But in execution, though, it severely invalidated a player's time investment and by proxy, a player's motivation to stay invested in the game. Other video games solve this dilemma with any of the following: a player trading system where current good gear helps acquire currency and items to later trade for future gear when the current set is unusable. Then there's a seasonal server and perhaps an all time server. This is more evergreen and includes all the items ever, or maybe that season specifically. A sequel to the game, alternative formats, a ban list like in Yu-Gi-Oh, power limits and/or economy systems.
Okay, so sunsetting, of course, has been a very controversial, shall we say, topic in Destiny, and Bungie has stated, I think, in the past that they don't really have plans to do any more sunsetting, so God only knows what's going to happen there given the current state of the game. And it's really no secret that I was not a fan of sunsetting. I still am not, but it is hard to deny that there's just so much in this game currently that it's making balance in particular, both for, whether it's weapons, abilities, so on and so forth, that balance is pretty scuffed right now. So while I'm definitely not a fan of sunsetting per se, I fully acknowledge that it does help with things such as power creep and bloat and whatnot, and I would be potentially open to seeing it happen again if some of the suggestions that, like CammyCakes said, were to come to fruition. And if, certain, evergreen styles of content where, you can use whatever you want, get some sort of rework, again, particularly on the PvE side, like strikes and that sort of thing, your base level strikes and whatnot. If they got some sort of rework to make them more engaging and to give me a reason to really jump into them again, then I would be more okay with the idea of sunsetting. On top of that, my other two things that I would say is, one, exotics just should not be sunset, because if I find out I can't use Ace of Spades and Trials of Osiris tomorrow, I'm going to have a shit fit. And two, I would still want to see, any, especially like sunset weapons, remain relevant inside of the majority of PvP. That was one of the few, I think, wise decisions that Bungie made when they decided to sunset a bunch of stuff, is that you could still use pretty much whatever you wanted in the majority of your PvP activities, and they did not sunset exotics. So just a couple thoughts on that. I just wanted to discuss that briefly because it's, sunsetting and power creep and all that. It's been something we've seen talked about, on Twitter and whatnot a lot more among the Destiny community and content creators and whatnot. So I just wanted to give my thoughts on that very briefly. Continuing on. Okay, so this next section is a long one. It's about 6 or 7 minutes, but he's talking about random rolls versus crafting here, another very much hot topic lately. So we're going to go through it anyway, because this is something that needs to be addressed and something that needs to be talked about, and I just want to give my thoughts on it afterwards. So let's just watch this really quick, and then we'll talk about it afterwards.
This brings us to random rolls versus crafting. Random rolls of gear can create an improbable opportunity to have a specific build. However, the unpredictable nature makes completing activities for rewards more exciting, because the next run could be the one where you're rewarded. It could also lead to imbalance in competitive areas, so that's worth mentioning. By contrast, the current version of crafting provides a guaranteed end goal of acquiring a specific build. However, the predictable nature leaves only the quality of the activity left to be judged. Let's talk about how crafting was supposed to be a better compromise of intrinsic, extrinsic player types than what it really released like back then. So this is taking away from one of my previous slides. So if you're seeing this again, this is why. The cons of crafting in its current implementation. It's at odds with the looter-shooter genre. We just kind of went over that. It ruins the eternal chase for the god roll. Activities are reworked to drip feed crafting materials and progress with red boxes. This can lead to frustration trying to obtain a full weapon pattern from these artificial time gates. There's no/little forward progress outside of seasonal activities in most cases. Enhanced perks, this is the most important one. Enhanced perks ruin the value of random rolls and adept weapons. There's more material items to keep track of and less incentive to recomplete activities. Pros in its current implementation. It curbs RNG and is sometimes a guaranteed path to specific loot acquisition. There's less incentive to recomplete boring activities. You just wait 5 weeks and then you start your seasonal grind, because you can just grab all 5 of your patterns at once. It's a new player-friendly gearing path with less fear of missing out. I actually really love this for my new player friends. I just give them a list of what they need, exact perks, and then we game together like a week later. It's a cosmetic flex for a crafted date, kill counter, and memento shader. It saves on vault space. You could just recraft with the normal perks when you need the weapon, and I do this a lot for Grandmaster Nightfalls when I'm running an off-meta build. I'll just choose to recraft like a Strand Auto Rifle or something like that. And it's easier to test new builds and ideas, like when I'm wondering, back to that bloat slide, if new interactions work with old things, and I want to know right then. What makes a good crafting system? Number one, it creates a purpose to engage with all content. Number two, a deterministic endpoint and or bad luck protection. And three, it enables specific build crafting for a cost. So let's put crafting and sunsetting together. I truly believe that there could have been a future where crafting was harmoniously implemented alongside yearly sunsetting and massive content drops. The key word is massive, because if most builds / playstyles went extinct overnight, it would be difficult to convince a player to feel a sense of permanence in their game experience. The idea would be to subtly reset the relative power level without making crowd favorite builds unrecognizable. Crafting would also have to allow for random rolls to always be valuable. Simply allowing random rolls to enhance perks would be a reasonable start in today's implementation of crafting. If you wanted to go further, you could give them like shiny cosmetics for randoms or something like that, just to set apart that you did the random version or you got lucky. Can sunsetting still happen? Yes. I think these factors would contribute to it landing better this time. Number one, again, massive content drops. Number two, every item has some craftable and or reobtainable form. 3. Manage power creep effectively rather than rotate a new overused gimmick each season. Some semblance of balance is paramount to endgame feeling good. Number 4. Evergreen areas need to be significantly updated, meaning places where older gear can be used. This can also be in tandem with alternative formats that rotate both in and out old and newer gear. This helps alleviate fear of missing out because you can go get the evergreen stuff whenever you really want to. Number 5. Less rotators and time gating. Instead, you could maybe do a daily / weekly bonus, and that could help. I had a situation last week where a friend is like, I want to do all these activities, and they listed like 10 activities, and I told them none of those are in this weekly rotation. They go, I'll see you next week. Number 6, flat difficulty options. For example, easy, legend, grandmaster, contest, and a power level option. Offer a bonus to choosing to participate in the power level chores, because a common complaint I've been getting is people like the old power level system because it meant that their friends list was more filled at the beginning of a season, and their clanmates would want to run activities just to make the power level go up, and it felt like they had more community contribution. So this could be a nice compromise. For all of this to matter though, we still have to have new players joining each season without feeling overwhelmed, which brings us to...
Okay, so talking about crafting and whatnot really quick. I like crafting. Hell, I love crafting for, like he said, you get to spend more times in activities that you enjoy. I'm a PvP main. I like crafting because it allows me to get back to focusing on what I enjoy faster. On top of that, and this is something he said that I hadn't even really considered, but crafting saving vault space is invaluable. Having an overcrowded vault is really annoying, and constantly running out of vault space is frustrating. I just recently had to go into my vault and do a bit of cleaning, and constantly having to worry about that is just really annoying. I would like to see more vault space happen eventually. I don't know if it will. But crafting allowing us to save some vault space is great. It means that opposed to, when I look at a weapon, I see a bunch of different rolls that I want, as opposed to having to keep, potentially 3, 4, 5 rolls in my vault, I can just have 1 or 2 crafted versions and swap out perks and masterworks and whatnot as I see fit. I will say also that crafting has for sure hurt the loot incentive in this game, the incentive to sit and grind out various activities. And I think really the biggest thing they could do to address this would be to make it so that you can enhance perks on any weapon at all. This would make, weapons that are not craftable more appealing, and it would make, potential side grade style weapons, which is another thing that he talks about in this video. And again, you should go watch the whole video. It would make them more, way more appealing, such as, something that he talked about, Cantata being a side grade when compared to something like, Palindrome or Exalted Truth or something like that. Just for the sake of comparison, I know that like one is kinetic and one is energy, right? You have, let's say, Austringer versus Cantata. Austringer is obviously the far more valuable choice because it's craftable, you can get enhanced perks, and you can pick your masterwork. But if you could get a Cantata, right, and you got a, God Roll Cantata, and you could enhance those perks, that would make the Cantata a much more viable and a much more appealing option. On top of that, something that we had, back in, I want to say year one with like vanilla Destiny 2, can't remember how long, this was around, but we had the ability to re-roll masterworks, and that is something I wish to God they would bring back. That is another thing that would make grinding for random rolls a lot more appealing. I cannot tell you how frustrated I've gotten when, I've gotten like a 4 out of 5 roll on something, and the only thing that's missing is the masterwork, right? I have a rose like that. It has hammer-forged rifling, accurized rounds, perpetual motion, explosive payload, but it's missing the range masterwork. That's the exact roll I want, minus the masterwork. If I could re-roll that until I get a range masterwork, that would make trying to get random drops so much more appealing, especially in activities that can be a slog that a lot of people don't necessarily enjoy doing, such as, say, Trials of Osiris or something like that. The ability to just say, this masterwork is not what I want, I'm just going to re-roll it and turn, a 3 out of 5 to a 4 out of 5 or a 4 out of 5 to a 5 out of 5. That would make trying to grind for random drop loot exponentially less frustrating. But even with all of that, something that I want to talk about too is that we can talk about, power creep and bloat and all of that, but regardless of, if crafted weapons existed or not, or if sunsetting, happened again or ever happened or not, none of that matters while abilities are as insanely overtuned as they are. As what I think is honestly the perfect example, whenever ad clear comes up, the one thing you'll always hear is, hey, forbearance. Forbearance is the best ad clear weapon in the game. All you need is forbearance, blah, blah, blah. Forbearance makes every other, potential ad clear option in the game completely irrelevant. Here's the thing. Forbearance is also completely and utterly irrelevant when I have an Arc Hunter build with Shinobu's Vow that does everything that Forbearance does, but better on an exponential level. And it's not just that. There are a dozen other builds that, you could use as an example, whether, a Sunbracers build, potentially even something like, an Assassin's Cowl build. The build crafting in this game has gotten so absurdly potent that your weapons just flat out don't matter. All of this talk about, weapon balance, PvE specifically, right? Because PvP, I would say, is the last place where your weapons do actually matter. In PvE, none of, the balancing and all that, none of that matters when I can go to YouTube and look up a 5-minute build video and just copy and paste that build into, my own character or whatever, and immediately have something that does the job of, potentially 2 or 3 different weapons, but better 1,000 times over. So while this is still a good discussion to have about weapons, especially, for someone like me who mostly does weapon reviews, we need to have abilities reined in substantially in both PvE and PvP, because as it stands right now, they're just way too potent. Even in endgame stuff like, GMs, master raids, master dungeons, outside of like boss DPS, my weapons don't matter because I would say anywhere from 80 to 90% of my kills come from my abilities. So the first thing I would want to see reined in substantially from a balance perspective is our abilities. And after that, then I think it would be better to then move on and talk about weapons and power creep and crafting and all of that. That's just something that I kind of wanted to add about this. The ability uptime and potency and ability spam has been kind of a pain point for me in this game for pretty much ever since the 3.0 systems came out, with Witch Queen. They just completely made, weapons and all that almost entirely irrelevant in PvE. And it also, I would say, was arguably one of the worst things to ever happen to PvP because, as annoying as something like Immortal or Bows or, the Antaeus Ward's Titan sliding at you with a shotgun or a fusion or whatever, as annoying as all that is, even in PvP, I would say as a whole, your abilities are going to be far more impactful than your weapons, especially inside of something like, Trials of Osiris or Comp. So what I would add to this is just rein in abilities first, and then, then put a huge amount of focus into trying to, find some way to address power creep, to address, the overpotency of crafting, so on and so forth. Also, flat difficulty options inside of PvE would be fantastic, and it would just make PvE a better experience. And I think the perfect example of this is contest mode should always be available on every single raid that we have in the game, on any raids that they bring back, and on any raids that come in the future, because quite frankly, while the normal raids are fine for just, trying to get loot, farm spoils, whatever. The best experience you will have in a raid is on contest mode, and it's not even close. Moving on.
Brings us to the new player experience. When you show a new friend Destiny 2, what do you even tell them to buy? Can anybody at Bungie tell me what is optimal to buy? If anything, I feel like I'm the authority on this subject because I don't even buy anything. I just make free-to-play accounts and min-max them as hard as I can until they're better or equal to a paid player. It takes a long time to do it, but it's a fun challenge to overcome. The answer is they shouldn't have to deal with any of this. There should be one or two very clear options on what you're getting and less nickel and diming. So a new player logs in. Where do they go? I know that they probably have less planets and stuff like that on their screen, but just assuming you're a new player and bumbling about, where do you go? What do you do when your inventory starts filling up? How do you do it? What's the strategy? Well, if they knew anything, they would just use Well of Radiance. What are all these things in my inventory? What do I do with them? What's valuable? If I use this now, is it going to screw me over in the future? I feel like the Guardian rank implementation was a decent tutorial system. It's definitely a good starter. I think I'd talk about this here. Yeah, in concept, Guardian ranks can simultaneously act as a tutorial for newer players and a credibility check for endgame players. In parentheses here, I didn't put it, don't be toxic. While it's an okay first attempt at this system, the tutorial needs to be more expansive to help assist new players when acclimating to the game. This could involve embedded video examples, hands-on missions, curated example builds, etc. So further improvements I'd like to see to the new player experience, I honestly think Guardian Ranks covers most of them, is like a future initiative or a campaign on social media or YouTube or something like that to help out newer players for a cosmetic reward. This would also include more free-to-play weekends of newer expansions so people can try it out and see if they like it in the first place.
Okay, yeah, this has been such a a frustrating part of Destiny, and that is the new player experience and the absurd cost of entry. Coming back to this screenshot real quick, I want you to, first off, look at all that DLC, and then second off, look at that cost. That's nearly $600, and no one can afford that, right? And I cannot tell you how many times I've gotten frustrated because, someone who I know who's, maybe they've seen my videos, they've heard me talk about Destiny, whatever. They come to me and they say, hey, this game looks interesting. It looks fun. I'm interested in it. How do I get into it? And then I have to spend the next 20 minutes writing a college essay on what they need to prioritize, where they should put their money, depending on what they want out of the game. And nearly every single time I've done this, I have watched the interest that they had just fade away because no one wants to have to spend, potentially, $100 or more fucking dollars just to play the game and to have a good experience in the game. And this is monumentally frustrating, and it's something that desperately needs to be addressed. One idea that I do have that I think, would really help with the new player experience is one, please, for the love of God, right, for the free-to-play players, because let's be real, most people who are interested in Destiny, they're going to try the free-to-play experience out first, and when you compare the free-to-play, the amount of content in the free-to-play experience and whatnot versus someone who has been playing this game for years and has bought the DLCs as they've come out and so on and so forth, the difference is night and day. So the first thing I would say is please, and I know this is probably a tall order, but it would for sure help get more people into the game. Please bring back the Red War, Curse of Osiris, and Warmind. Those three used to be, available to free-to-play players, and though all three of them, even, Curse of Osiris, all three of them are so much better and provide such a better, more interesting introduction into the world of Destiny than the current free-to-play, quote unquote campaign, which you can blow through in like an hour or two, doesn't really provide any information, that's valuable about the game or the Destiny universe, so on and so forth. Please bring those back. You could even you can keep the current campaign, but then after you beat that, 2 hour, whatever the hell it is, you should be able to go into those other campaigns and experience them because, they were all pretty important parts of Destiny's history. Even, Curse of Osiris, which I would still say is the worst DLC in Destiny history, that still was important to what Destiny is today, largely because it introduced Osiris. The other thing I would say is, like the free weekends and stuff are fantastic, but I think it's time for Bungie to start thinking about periodically making older DLCs just free for everyone, available to everyone. As an example, there is exactly zero reason anyone should still be having to pay for, what content is still available from Forsaken. Just, make that free, and that alone would help get a lot of people into the game. I would have such an easier time getting new players into this game if I could say, hey, Forsaken was, the golden age of Destiny, and, the raid, the Dreaming City, the exotics, Forsaken has some of the best exotics in the game, right? Like, obviously Ace of Spades is the first one that comes to mind to me. Thorn, of course, which is about to get a massive buff next season. If I could tell players, hey, you can get some of the best stuff in the game just for downloading it and trying it out and you don't have to pay for it, I can promise you that would get players way more interested in actually trying the game out. So I would say also, periodically, every 2, 3, 4 years, whatever, make one or two of the DLCs free. There's no reason people should be having to pay for what's left over of Forsaken. I would also argue that, quite frankly, I would say Shadowkeep should probably be free too, because, there just wasn't a whole lot to that DLC. Like, the campaign was pretty good when you actually got missions that weren't just fetch quests, but again, you make that free, they have access to another raid, which, has Divinity, one of the most valuable exotics in the game. I can tell you right now, you want to get free-to-play players into the end game, if they have access to Divinity, they will have no trouble ever finding a team that will let them LFG because they can say, hey, I can be div bitch, right? So again, please, they need to consider making some of these older expansions, older pieces of DLC just free to play. It would help bring new players in. It would help keep those new players interested. It would help, it would help make them want more if they actually got a proper taste of what Destiny is. And the current free to play experience just does not offer that. But moving on, we're just going to keep rolling on here because that's another topic I could rant about potentially forever. So let's keep going.
By contrast, let's talk about the endgame player experience. This is where you wait on time gates to acquire the new stuff of the season, the new build parts or stronger gear. Power creep has led to a foregone conclusion of activity completion due to stagnant strongest meta options like Well of Radiance, Invis, and Strand Titan 1-2 Punch. An endgame player is pretty much just waiting on the new contest mode raid to release and to have the enemies hit back for once. It's essentially fear of missing out of either an experience or a crucially important gear piece that they will need for a future contest raid. The really invested players will eventually pivot to Gambit and Crucible since it involves real human opponents. Despite that, they will eventually run into a similar problem in those modes of balancing issues resulting in a stagnant meta and a very linear play.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. So, Endgame is the heart and soul of Destiny PvE. It always has been. Raids in particular, like GMs and dungeons, they're great. But when we talk about, sorry about that, when we talk about PvE in Destiny, raids are the heart and soul of PvE in Destiny, and it's not even close. Such as, like Destiny 1, vanilla Destiny 1 was awful. Not as bad as vanilla Destiny 2, but it was still really bad. But Vault of Glass was such a big deal for people who were playing when it came out that it kept the game on life support long enough for Bungie to kind of bring Destiny 1 back to life. The problem with Endgame is that the meta stays the same for way too long and it gets so insanely boring. You cannot tell me, I don't care who you are, you cannot tell me if you've been playing this game for more than a couple of months that you aren't completely sick of, pretty much every raid in the game, DPS phases consisting of just standing in a well and launching rockets at a boss until he dies over and over and over again in pretty much, again, every single raid we have in the game, in most of the dungeons we have in the game, and even inside of a lot of GMs. That's the best course of action. Stand in a well of radiance and launch rockets. I'm sorry. I don't care who you are. That meta has gotten so insanely boring. We need to have more frequent changes, for the meta inside of PvE. This is one of the reasons why Strand Titan on Crota's End and Lament with Crota's End, and don't get me wrong, Strand Titan is also, with Banner of War, it's also broken as hell. At some point it needs to be addressed. But even that, having a boss where, he's aggressive, he gets up close and personal, and you have to get up close and personal with him in order to do damage, makes that fight so much more interesting, as opposed to all of these raid bosses we have where, DPS just consists of, you have a large, mostly stationary target where you spend, however long launching rockets, throwing grenades, or just laying into them with, LFRs or LMGs or whatever. It's too stationary, it's too slow, it's too brain dead, quite frankly, and it's gotten boring. The PvE meta needs to change, and it needs to change a lot more frequently. Something that, Cammy talks about later on, and we'll talk about that too, would be nice to see, like we have in certain other MMOs, certain bosses where to really max out your DPS, you're having to, execute some pretty aggressive and complex combos. And, we'll talk about that again later. But that is something that really needs to happen in PvE. The meta needs to be more fluid. We need to have more options as far as, what, maximizing DPS looks like. That alone would help make so much of PvE so much more interesting. The closest thing that we've really had to having any sort of complexity in DPS, I would say, would be like hot swapping or, sword metas, that sort of thing, where you're having to worry, you're having to at least worry a little bit about what combos you're using and swapping weapons and that sort of thing. I think it could be expanded upon more though. But next, let's keep moving on because again, I don't want this video to be like 2 hours long.
Fatigue and burnout. Old players drop off and new players aren't really sticking with it, lead to low activity populations. Low population lead to longer queues, worse networking, and a generally more defined meta since you see higher skill players left remaining. Veteran players aren't surprised anymore with the seasonal model and often feel fatigued from running the same chore for essentially the last decade. This may lead to burnout, which could have them filling spare time with other games, which could make the further pain points of Destiny that much more evident. Players basically just sit in orbit and feel aimless on what could be fun to play as they watch their friends list become less populated with each login.
Okay, so burnout, that's something that I just want to make a very quick note on, a couple of points on that. Burnout is, with any game that requires a, degree of dedication, to really stay into, whether that's Destiny or something like, World of Warcraft. Burnout is just inherently a part of this sort of game, MMOs and whatnot. It's just part of the game. And just a couple things that I would say that will really help people avoid burnout that I feel like enough people just don't do is, first off, don't marry yourself too much to the meta, whether that's PvE, PvP, whatever. Don't marry yourself too much to the meta. You will have so much more fun in this game if you just try different stuff out every now and then. The second thing is that it is perfectly okay to just take a break now and then. Whether that's, as simple as, oh, I'm having a bad PvP day, I'm going to go do PvE if you're a PvP main. If you're just, kind of burnt out on the game as a whole and you need to take a break for, anywhere from a few days to, a few weeks, it's okay to do that. The game is still going to be there when you come back. And if you can learn to do that, it makes it so much easier to not just get completely burnt out on a game like Destiny. And this is something I've had to learn to do too, and something that I, periodically will do is for, anywhere from the last few days to the last week of a season, I will, play very little Destiny if I play at all, and I'll just go play other games, do other things, so on and so forth. And the game is still there when I come back, right? It's okay to do that every now and then, and that is the biggest tip I can give you to avoid getting burnt out on a game like Destiny or anything, even remotely similar to Destiny in the world of MMOs and continuously evolving, subscription games or, games that fall under the games as a service, model. If you can learn to take breaks, you will avoid burnout so much more efficiently. Moving on.
Does Destiny need to evolve, though, to keep player interest? So, it's genuinely one of my favorite games of all time. It mixes elements of Halo, Borderlands, and Phantasy Star Online. And while I still find joy in most of my play sessions, I can't speak for the whole community. The final shape is supposed to be the conclusion to the saga, but not the end of Destiny. I'm positive most players are very curious as to how the saga will pan out, so I'm not really worried about those sales numbers. But I'm not sure they're going to be optimistic about the future of Destiny, especially if the final shape misses. I would confidently say that the game needs to evolve with future iterations of Destiny, and today, this might be the crux at which we realize it's worth waiting for Destiny 3 to innovate. And I realize the magnitude of what I just said. It could be 5 years or a decade from now for that. I think it might be worth waiting. It might be worth investing in. This really is that good of a game.
Okay, so echoing what CammyCakes said there, Destiny is my favorite game of all time, and it's not even close. No other game has ever kept my attention as long as Destiny has. I have at this point, like 5,000 or so, nearly 5,000 hours in the game. And no, I don't have that amount of time in any other game that I've ever played. Destiny has held my attention for such a crazy amount of time. It would probably be double or triple that if I didn't have to work like a normal full-time job and that sort of thing. I love Destiny. It's a great game. It's just right now, it's not in the best place. That being said, I would say for sure Destiny does need to evolve more. I don't know what Bungie's plans for that are, whether that's, Destiny 3 or just the continued evolution of Destiny 2, or, potentially what, personally I would like to see at some point is just, a major kind of relaunch of Destiny 2 of some sort. Regardless, there does need to be some form of evolution inside of Destiny. And some things that I think could help with that would be first, and this might be, this for sure is something that would have to wait until either like Destiny 3 or again like a major relaunch of Destiny 2, because I fully understand this would be in an extremely tall order. But if at all possible, separate the PvP and PvE sandboxes completely. This would allow for more precise tuning, which a perfect example of that is the recent nerf to young Ahamkara's spines. It desperately needed a nerf inside of PvP, but the result is that it pretty well got nuked inside of PvE. And while the, Ahamkara's spines builds inside of PvE weren't necessarily the strongest, a lot of people used them just because, spines were fun in PvE. And that was, enough reason for a lot of people to use them. And the result of young Ahamkara's getting the nerf that it did is now it's not even remotely as potent inside of PvE as it was before, and there's basically no point in using it. If we could separate the sandboxes in some sort of way for more precise tuning, that I think would help a lot, especially on the balance side, because, that way when the devs are having to try to figure out, okay, how do we, if something is completely broken inside of PvP, right? Whether that's, young Ahamkar spines, Luminarch, whatever, that would allow them to, not have to worry about, nerfing it in a certain way to make it, less broken inside of PvP without risking completely destroying it inside of PvE. So that's one thing that I would say as well. Some other notes here is I would say that on the PvP side, Destiny needs to lean more into being a shooter. Checkmate is a very good first step in this direction with the reduced ability uptime and whatnot. And PvE on the flip side should lean way more into the MMO RPG side. This could mean things such as, large random world bosses or events, something kind of similar to Vex Strike Force, but ideally on a larger scale, with event or boss specific loot, more variety, and the ability to more precisely tune builds for build crafting, for different roles, meaning really that, a lot of the build crafting in Destiny between the three classes is pretty similar, right? You want max resilience, max discipline, and then, typically you're building into like grenades or something like that, right? What I mean by this is give us the ability to actually build into different roles, such as, a true glass cannon sort of role where you can't take a lot of damage, but man, can you dish it out? Or, a tank role, as opposed to having it, constantly be both at the same time. If we could build into specific roles to fill specific gaps in a fire team or something like that, it would make build crafting a lot more rewarding. It would make PvE way more engaging, and it would add a much wider variety to the different sorts of gameplay loops that we have inside of PvE right now. And it would help things be a lot less broken, right? Like there's a lot of overlap between like a glass cannon and a tank right now. You can make it so that you barely take any damage and you're also just dishing out a ton of damage, and being able to do that is pretty broken, right? Like Strand Titan, I think, is the best example of that. Banner of War is, borderline, a mobile Well of Radiance. I wouldn't say it's as broken as Well of Radiance, but, it's kind of approaching that area where it's like, man, this is way too strong. And on top of that, if you're using like Synthos with, the 1-2 punch shotgun, you can, just deal out an insane amount of damage, and it just makes those builds way too potent. So if roles could be separated a bit more and we had the ability to really build into the style of play that we like, that would help PvE tremendously. It would make PvE so much more fun. Like, I tend to enjoy more of a glass cannon sort of role, and if I had to trade, survivability for the, ability to just dish out just mass destruction at the cost of, if, I can't take much damage at all, I'm fine with that. The ability to build into a very specific role would just make PvE so much more interesting. Another thing I would say is it would be really nice to have some endgame activities with a higher player count. Like, I know that for balance purposes and whatnot, it wasn't something that could stay in the game, but for a brief period, we had, there was a bug where you could do a raid with 12 people. Now, obviously, with the raids that we have in the game currently, that was completely broken, right? But it would be really nice if in the future, whether it's a raid or something completely different, if we had something that was just tough as nails, but where you could have, 8, 10, 12 players all doing it at the same time. That would be a lot of fun. Having different activities with a higher player count would also make things, I think, just a lot more interesting and a lot more fun.
Destiny is more than a first person shooter, MMO, RPG. Not even gonna explain this. It is an entire universe that can span spin off related games and media of any kind. I did say I was gonna reach in this video, so humor me while I say how cool it would be to see any of the following in my lifetime: a dedicated PvE Destiny looter shooter, a dedicated PvP Destiny arena shooter, a rogue-like dungeon crawler with fan favorite Destiny items, an expanded Gambit style hero MOBA, a Shadowrun esque tack shooter. That would kind of be similar to Valorant, but I feel like Destiny has such a unique sandbox that it could add to making it the best version of that. A horror game from the perspective of a lightless citizen or something like that, dealing with all the enemies of Destiny. A space battle PvP with combined arms. Think like back to the days of Star Wars Battlefront, except much more refined. Then we could go something that isn't even a game, like a Destiny anime with an original unrelated story.
Yeah, this is something that I've thought for a long time, and that is there is so much potential in the Destiny universe that it's, I mean, we're talking like Warhammer 40K amounts of potential in the Destiny universe. There's so much potential for different types of spin-offs that I would love to see, you know, there actually be some. So like a couple things I personally would like to see. One thing is I really did love the idea that Cammy had of, a combined arms kind of like, Battlefront or Battlefield-esque spinoff, mainly because like Drake tanks and gunships are really dope, and it would be nice to be able to use them in some sort of PvP format. Another thing I would honestly really love to see would be a spinoff that, is like Destiny 2, right? The same sort of game, but that takes place in either the Dark Ages, where you have like the Iron Lords versus the Warlords, or in the early days of the Last City, because man, would it be badass to fight alongside Lord Shaxx in the Battle of Twilight Gap. Another thing I think would be really cool would be a tactical shooter. And when I think tactical shooter, I don't really think of games like, Valorant or CSGO or anything like that. What I usually think of are games like Arma, Insurgency, Ready or Not, that sort of thing. And I think a tactical shooter in the style of something like Ready or Not, where you just play as a normal human who's maybe a part of like the Last City Defense Force or something like that, would be amazing. Like, think about it like this. When you're a Guardian, right, you see a Hive Ogre. It's like, oh, okay, whatever. I'm just going to burn my super, just take him out, no big deal. If you're just a normal human, right, and you see an ogre, that shit has to be terrifying. That has to be horrifying. That has to be like, shit your pants, what the hell are we gonna do levels of scary. And I think if you took that sort of perspective and mixed it with something like Ready or Not, which, by the way, Ready or Not is a great game, and one of the reasons for that is because it is such a, like, anxiety-inducing, harrowing experience that if you took that and gave, a Destiny game, spin-off game, that sort of experience, that would be insanely intense and potentially even kind of terrifying, and that is something that I would really love to see happen.
What makes for a fun Destiny 2 experience? In my opinion, there are 5 elements that are important. Number 1, building both far reaching and deep. It's okay to have specific places for specific niches. Don't create activities with an intent to destroy them, expand them as needed. Number 2, a long term plan for balancing. Incorporate systems that offer more levers to properly tune the experience in the short term, too. This could be gear score limits, rotating formats, curated experiences, etc. Number 3, difficulty options can make all aspects of the gameplay matter. From a PvP standpoint, it feels wrong to have both SBMM and artificial limiters on what a player can build into simultaneously. Think about this in regards to aerial effectiveness, flinch, radar accuracy, handling, ground landing aim punch, etc. All of these hinder a higher skill ceiling, and yet skill-based matchmaking matters. So does it really matter if the best players are not interacting with the worst players? I think it's okay to have player expression. Number 4, a reward structure that should respect time investment while also keeping players on their toes about what the next reward could be. Number 5, social spaces and features need to feel social. LFG should be an intuitive part of gaming that you don't have to go out of the game to experience, but maybe if you need it more refined.
Okay, a few just very quick notes on that section, purely from a PvP perspective, and these are just a few things that are, pain points personally for me. First off, SBMM, skill-based matchmaking, has no place in casual modes at all, period. It needs to go away inside of 6v6 completely. And comp really needs to be on a, true ladder system as opposed to this, janky as hell rank and SBMM system that we have currently. Next up, AE, airborne effectiveness, that needs to just go away completely. They tried it, it didn't work, it's still incredibly annoying. Building into it is difficult and requires sacrificing things that are just objectively way more valuable, to the point of, having more AE just not being worth it at all. Like, if I'm crafting an Austringer, there is no way in hell that I am trading Eye of the Storm for Air Assault, right? So AE just needs to go. Flinch needs to be reduced across the board on primary weapons. The one exception to that, I would say, would be bows. Flinch is probably a good thing to have on special weapons, but having it on, primary weapons outside of bows, to the degree that we do at the very least, is just dumb. And also, under no circumstances should damage perks or perks such as explosive payload increase flinch. For payload perks specifically, the way I would change that would be, instead of it doing increased flinch, instead make explosive payload do increased damage against barricades, targets with overshields, or targets standing inside of a rift. Next up, weapon bloom is dumb. I'm sorry, it just is. Ground landing aim punch is so insanely frustrating, especially on a hunter, where anytime you use the double jump, let alone the triple jump, you are having to deal with that. It's so frustrating, and at the very least, it needs to be reduced substantially. Next thing I would say is, Bungie, please stop being afraid of fast handling weapons. I legitimately think one of the worst things to happen to our weapons was the nerf to quick draw and the nerf to snapshot sights. I get that we have, some substitutes in theory, but here's the thing. First off, Slick Draw sucks. It's a bad perk. It's terrible. I don't care what anyone says. Slick Draw is ass. Threat Detector is great when it actually works. Something that I've noticed on Threat Detector is it's very inconsistent. There are times on my Matador 64 that has, Threat Detector opening shot, the roll everyone wants, where sometimes, I'm near an enemy and that thing whips out so goddamn quick when I swap to it that it even surprises me. And there are other times where I have an enemy, even closer, and the goddamn shotgun pulls out so insanely slowly that I can't get it out in time for when I actually need it. Then lastly, Surplus is terrible. I get that it adds a ton of benefits, but Surplus is terrible, especially in the current sandbox where you are constantly needing to use your abilities. Surplus may as well not even exist at all. So please, I am begging you, for the love of God, make Quick Draw and Snapshot, more common perks, at least on certain weapons, and please undo the nerfs that were done to them. Slow feeling weapons objectively feel like shit. They feel terrible. Fast handling weapons will always feel better. They make gunplay way more fun, way more interesting, way faster, way more intense. Please bring those perks back in their OG forms. Now, on that same topic, from a balance perspective as well, at some point this conversation needs to happen, and that is, certain weapons straight up should not have access to certain perks. As an example, aggressive and I would say even precision frame SMGs should not have target lock. That would mean that, the two weapons, right, aggressive frame and precision frame SMGs, where target lock is the biggest issue, they don't have it, and that avoids the risk of, potentially them having to just completely nuke target lock across the board, even on other weapons where target lock is still useful, but not completely broken. Another example of this, I would say, would be, there is absolutely no reason whatsoever that sniper rifles should have access to aim assist increasing perks. Sniper rifles should not have access to opening shot. They should not have access to moving target, period. And the thing is, Bungie has done this before. most specifically when Bungie removed Quick Draw from aggressive frame shotguns. The only aggressive frame shotgun that still has Quick Draw are some of the old sunset rolls of Mindbender's Ambition. Now, to be perfectly blunt, I don't think that removing Quick Draw on aggressive frame shotguns was necessary, because if anything, it gave shotguns, those shotguns, a much more viable role as a defensive weapon. It made shutting down, the Titan who's just spent the entire match just aping people with, his own shotgun. It made it way easier to shut him down because, you turn the corner and he's right there. He's sliding at you. You can whip out your quick draw, Fellwinter's Lie, Astral Horizon, whatever, and shut that shit down. And then you've just taught him that if he sees you, he might actually have to think about pulling out a primary weapon. Crazy idea, right? But with shotguns, because I don't want to appear too biased against other weapons here, and I love shotguns, I do think there is a conversation to be had about, maybe at the very least, precision frame and aggressive frame shotguns, maybe they shouldn't have slide shot. I would also say on, a similar topic, certain things just should not work on certain weapons, such as an example, unflinching mods and targeting mods absolutely should not work on snipers or bows at all, period. So those are just a few of my own personal pain points. Again, that's, specifically from a PvP perspective. Let's move on.
How can Destiny 2.5, or whatever we call it moving on from here, or Destiny 3 in the future, evolve? Again, humor me for reaching very far here. Call me Mr. Fantastic or something. I would like to see more of a toolbox of abilities and weapons, perhaps a hotbar that allows for many cooldowns and skills to complement shooting. Rather than the stationary rocket dumps we're used to, it'd be crazy to see what high DPS could look like when it relies on complex combos that reward proper aim, spacing, blocking or parrying, and timing in relation to consistent boss attacks. Think about your combo window and squeezing in as much DPS as possible when you realize a boss is committing to an attack pattern. That is extremely high skill, and when you finally nail that, it is one of the best feelings in gaming. I get that from so many other games, and I would love to see that in Destiny. The next thing is enemy evolution to more roaming bosses, coordinated adds, maybe bullet hell, and more action mechanics instead of solving puzzles. That doesn't mean puzzles don't have a place, though. And they would have to incorporate and expand on elemental effects in in-game combat, and this could go in tandem with a more dedicated support and magic playstyle. Then you could have former enemies as playable characters, perhaps like a Cabal class or something like that, and if needed, keep it out of PvP. I think we have learned that it's nice to have both of them work together in harmony, but typically one hurts the other way more, and it goes both ways over the years, and I don't think the community is as happy as they could be. The next thing is to focus on replayability of content and less on expendability. Think of roguelike systems, and also quality of life updates are great to the Rotator playlist, to just the Vanguard Strike playlist, to PvP day to day. That's why I log in. The new expansion's great, but those are the daily drivers. You could also have more creative player things like Forge and custom challenge modifiers. Those are great too.
Okay, so on that note, yes, for one thing that I'll just get out of the way real quick, activities that are built with, less expendability would be fantastic. I cannot tell you how much I have been wishing for another seasonal activity like Menagerie, right? That's what I would like to see, is fewer, salvages and more menageries, because Menagerie was an activity that, despite being a, technically at least seasonal activity, it had real staying power. It had some great mechanics. It had interesting encounters. I would love to see more, activities come with different seasons that actually have a reason to stick around. Next up, the idea of complex combos for DPS is something that I love. Having to, actually use your brain in a DPS phase is always going to be more interesting than, again, just sitting in a well and launching rockets. And that isn't really something we've had inside of Destiny 2. I think the closest we've had to that would be, when people were like hot swapping with slug shotguns and that sort of thing. Or, boss fights like Crota, where, it primarily is reliant on, like swords and melee supers and that sort of thing, where you're actually having to, think a little bit about your combos and all that. But boss fights that require you to think on your feet and execute combos, whether that's for maximum DPS or just to look cool, will always be way more fun and way more satisfying. The next thing is, yes, more roaming bosses, please, please. Some of my favorite raid bosses in the game, honestly, are probably Crota, Rolk, and yes, even Nezarec, because having a boss that is constantly moving around, that is aggressive, that is constantly trying to get in your face, is just way more fun and way more engaging and way more intense than something like Atheon or Oryx or Tanyx or, whatever the name of the boss from Garden of Salvation is, can't think of it right now, where they're primarily just, large, mostly stationary targets where you can just turn your brain off and shoot rockets during DPS and basically never have to worry about them the rest of the time. One of the reasons I do genuinely love the Crota's End raid, the reprised one in Destiny 2, is because Crota is, for one thing, he's a pretty aggressive boss, and he's a boss that you kind of have to, always be aware of because he's going to be coming after you regardless of if it's DPS or not. So yes, please, more roaming bosses. I would say roaming bosses that are faster as well, and also bosses that are also more aggressive, where you have to worry about them for the entire encounter and not just during DPS. That would make boss fights, especially in like raids and, I would say dungeons too, just way more interesting and way more fun. And it would add way more, replayability to those encounters as well. More coordinated and smarter ads would be fantastic. It would make things way more intense. Like, I want you to imagine, right? You're doing, say, GM, dungeon, whatever. A teammate goes down. You go to their res, you're a Titan, you throw up a barricade. Imagine how much more interesting things would get if when you throw up a barricade, the ads know to either A, flank you, or B, they need to increase their amount of fire and to focus that fire on your barricade. That would make, even just fighting ads way more intense and way more fun. And it would just, make PvE, again, that's the big thing here, it would make PvE more engaging, more interesting, and would add more replayability to the different PvE activities we have in the game. I also agree with, having more action-oriented encounters. What I would like to see even more of is, puzzle encounters with more complex puzzles. We've seen some of that in, I would say especially Valve the Disciple and Last Wish. And I would like to have it where during those puzzles, while you're completing it, you also have much more intense and much more difficult combat at the same time.
I want to explain the expression, the monkey's paw curls, and I could go into this much deeper. We're going to keep it succinct. This expression means that you get what you want, but something horrible happens as a result of it. I can think of that feeling many times in Destiny's history. The biggest example was at the start of Destiny 2, when PvE was forced to be double primary to appease PvP balance. If somebody asked for a more balanced game, well, they technically got it, but at the expense of a more interesting one. Another example was when the flawless pool was removed in Trials in exchange for win-based matchmaking. It's like they got rid of the flawless pool, but what you got was much, much worse. And even today, what we have is slightly worse in the reward sensibility. I anticipate many fan critiques receiving a monkey's paw answer due to the game appealing to such a wide audience, not to mention, we as gamers don't know the reality of game development limitations. It's always worth it from the developer POV to double and triple check to make sure that feedback is received and understood.
So very quickly addressing that point, again, I think the biggest thing they could do to fix that issue would be separating the sandboxes. You're going to hear me probably talking about this a lot in the future, because this has become an issue that we've seen over and over and over again. And, again, the most recent one that we've had, the most obvious one, was Young Ahamkara's really needed a nerf in PvP, it got that nerf, but it was completely destroyed inside of PvE as a result. If the sandboxes were separated, we wouldn't have to worry about that sort of thing happening again. Now, also, once again, I do not know how viable that would be inside of, Destiny 2 in its current form. It probably isn't, to be perfectly honest, right? But in the future, whether that's, a relaunch of Destiny 2 or Destiny 3, this is something that needs to happen. The PvP and PvE sandboxes need to be two separate things.
Unrelated, but kind of related, since the whole point of making this today was about revenue. I believe that Eververse and the Bungie store have not reached their full potential yet. I'm aware that this may be because they're trying to keep a consistent theme in the Destiny universe. However, that mold's already been broken enough in the past to just consider abandoning it and completely going crazy. Examples include wizard hats for Warlock, a custom banner of War Flag for a Titan, a custom well sword for a Warlock, a candy cane arc staff for Hunter at Christmas, popular media collabs like a Hatsune Miku two-tailed fox ornament, Domino's Pizza, more finishers like the chair or the rope kick, sweaty confetti style mods, maybe sound effects, sparrow horns. The list goes on and on and on, and I'm sure my comment section could come out with even more stuff that they would throw money at the screen for. Take, for instance, this proof of concept dad rifle dad hat that I commissioned an eternity ago. If the Bungie store leaned into these type of memes, I would buy these type of things. I'd buy them for the whole family. This is so funny. I'd wear it on stream. Also, the raid apparel never misses. This brings us to the end.
Okay, so I'm going to stop it here. This is kind of, the outro section of the video and whatnot. And again, please go watch, the original CammyCakes video. It's a fantastic video. I wasn't able to go through everything here. I potentially, could have done a lot more, but this video would have been crazy long. Please go and watch that video, link in the description. But on that last note too, I am not anti-Eververse by any means. I just want Eververse to feel, one, like it's more worth my money, and I agree with Cammy that it could be greatly enhanced. One big thing that I have wanted in Destiny for a very long time, and this has been discussed by other creators as well, like Astacross brought it up, would be player housing. So coming into Destiny 2 real quick, just for the, sake of kind of being able to show you what I mean. Imagine if, you're a new player or a longtime player, but you get, your first, player housing sort of deal for free, right? It's just something that you get, and it's, like in this little area, it's kind of like an apartment sort of deal. They could put like one of the elevators that they've put in other parts of the tower in like this corner or something. You take the elevator up and you get one of these little like apartments on the side here, right? And I'm just showing this area because I think this would kind of be the perfect spot for like your first, quote unquote house to be, right? And then, in the future, you could have the option to, buy property, whether that would be, houses or apartments, condos, whatever, in other places in the game. Like, imagine how dope it would be if you could have a player, like, apartment inside of the Last City with a window looking out at the Last City skyline and the streets below. That would be so cool. Imagine how dope it would be if you were also able to customize your apartments or houses or whatever with things such as custom lighting, where you could maybe neon it up, go for a very kind of cyberpunk look, or maybe go for a more Eris Morn is my roommate sort of look with lanterns and whatnot. Having a degree of customization where you could make your living space look like anything from, a high fantasy tavern to a cyberpunk apartment. I really like cyberpunk stuff, which is why I keep bringing that up. Imagine being able to have, say, like a display where you can showcase your favorite weapons that shows the kill counters for those weapons. Like, and I don't know if he actually would, but if I were Terror and my Ace of Spades has 200,000 kills on it, you bet your ass I'm going to buy that display so that I can show that off if I bring, my friends, people I play with, into my, little house or apartment or whatever. I would want to have that there. You could have an armor stand where you could show off, your favorite looks, a place where you could display seals, or maybe say you beat a day one raid, something from the boss as a trophy. You get the idea here, right? Also, clan halls. The first MMO that I ever played years ago, I think I was literally like 14 years old, something like that. It was this little kind of like anime MMO, that was the style of it, called Mabinogi. That was my first ever MMO. And in that game, clans or guilds, as they were called in that game, could actually buy castles, and those would serve the purpose of being a guild hall. And that was just such a cool addition to have. If something like that in Destiny would be fantastic, just a place for, you could have like a section where you could access your vault and whatnot, but a place that isn't just the helm, where like you and your clan can meet up, whether it's to prepare for a raid or, whatever. That's something that I think people would, be really interested in and invest in. And, options to purchase, things to customize these places or the places themselves. It could be any number of things, right? They could be on rotation for bright dust, kind of like certain things are now. They could be for silver. They could be available for things like glimmer and that sort of thing inside the game as well. But that is one thing that I would love to see. And that is something that, if that was in Eververse or something, I would pretty happily pay money for. Also, like Cammy was saying, I would love to see more collaborations with other games or other universes. That would be fantastic. Like, if, just as an example, if Bungie did a collab with, say, Games Workshop, right, that gave us an ornament set for our armor that made my Titan look like a space marine, oh man, I would open my wallet so fast it would make the speed of light look slow. Now, switching over, we've come to the part where I just want to add some additions to this video. And this is mostly about PvP. We'll talk a little about PvE as well. And these aren't really in any specific order of importance or anything like that. They're just certain things that came to mind to me as I watched this video. They're mostly, certain pain points that have been a big deal to me personally. First off, the weapon sandbox. Like I said before, there needs to be a conversation about whether or not certain weapons should have access to certain perks. Coming back to the examples I used before, aggressive frame and precision frame SMGs should not have access to target lock. If you don't think target lock is broken on precision frame SMGs, you clearly have not used a good roll on Unending Tempest. Sniper rifles should not have access to opening shot or moving target, and they should not be affected by targeting mods outside of, I would say, like Icarus Grip is fine, or unflinching mods. Those should not work with sniper rifles at all, or bows for that matter. Which brings me into my next point, which is flinch. I can absolutely understand the necessity of it on special weapons and bows, but outside of that, it needs a serious reduction, and under no circumstances should payload perks or damage perks like Mori on Ace of Spades increase that flinch. Now, coming back to payload perks, like I said before, I would make it so that they do more damage against Titan barricades, targets with an overshield, and targets standing in a rift. This would make fighting something like a payload 120 way less annoying, while also arguably just making them more useful as a whole. Also, weapons or armor pieces that are problematic need to be addressed far, far more quickly. Bows are the perfect example of this. Looking at usage rates just isn't enough. Bows have always been broken, and they've only gotten more broken. It's just that people are only now realizing it. So now Bungie is acknowledging it, but they're not getting adjusted until next season. And they said they were going to be making that adjustment to them next season, weeks ago. And Teus Wards is another example. It was a problem for months, for way, way too long. This trend of waiting months, or in the case of something like bows, years before addressing broken stuff needs to stop. For that matter, please, no more half-ass nerfs. I'm not asking for any weapon that's broken to immediately be nerfed into the ground to the point of being completely unusable, but nerfs have to be more substantial than something like the recent SMG nerf we got that changed absolutely nothing. Another thing is FBMM, fireteam-based matchmaking needs some sort of a rework. It's great if you're someone who usually plays with one or two of your buddies or whatever, but as a solo player, it's still awful. Playing solo and matching against like a 4-stack isn't actually any better than matching a 6-stack unless they're all just god-awful players. And I would say it's very much time. Please bring back the freelance nodes. Next up, one thing that I think would help, coming back to loot, one thing that I think would help random drops as opposed to crafting, like CammyCakes said in the video, make it so all weapons can get enhanced perks, and I would also say make focusing more of a factor. Focusing is one of the best things to happen to Destiny, but it could be even better. As an example, if I'm focusing a weapon and I'm looking for a particular role, give me the option to increase the chances of getting 1 or 2 of the perks from said role so I have a better chance of getting what I want. This would be especially helpful with weapons from the core playlists, such as from like Zavala or Shaxx, since a lot of those weapons actually have some pretty phenomenal perks. Like Bottom Dollar from Drifter is one of the best 120 hand cannons in the game, but your chances of getting the role you want are next to none because all of these playlist weapons have like a billion perks on them. On top of that, like I said before, please give us some way to re-roll the masterwork on our weapon, even if this, costs crafting materials, enhancement cores, whatever. Give us a way, please, to re-roll the masterworks. On top of that, make it possible to focus more weapons in more places. As a couple of examples, for some who may not know, Dares of Eternity doesn't just drop the anniversary weapons like the BXR, there's also a huge group of old weapons you can get from Dares of Eternity in a weekly rotation. Some of these are still great in PvP, like True Prophecy or Fractithist. Others aren't particularly strong in the meta, but are still a lot of fun to use, such as Dire Promise, or offer something unique that makes them worth having, such as the 7th Seraph CQC, which is a lightweight shotgun, and lightweight weapons are a godsend for hunter mains. And there are also some good PvE weapons, such as Ignition Code, which, funnily enough, is also very strong in PvP. The problem is, your chances of getting these weapons by themselves are already pretty low, and your chances of getting them with a good roll are basically next to none, which means that despite wanting a lot of these weapons, Fractithist and Dire Promise in particular in my case, I'm never in Dares, because I'm not about to spend potentially hundreds, and I do mean hundreds of runs, just trying to get, what typically is at best like a 3 out of 5 or a 4 out of 5 roll. I've done that once before. It was not a good time. It was frustrating and annoying, and I have barely touched Dares since. But if we had the option to focus these weapons at Xur or the Star Horse, if I had the option to focus like Fractithist or something, I'd be spending a hell of a lot of time inside of Dares, and it would help increase engagement with Dares as a whole and give it more replayability value beyond just getting your crafted BXR or, Wastelander or whatever. Another example in this area would be the Dreaming City. Granted, really the only weapon that I can think of that's strong in the current meta would probably be Retold Tale, but weapons like Waking Vigil and Twilight Oath are still really fun. And if I had a way to focus them with like Petra or something, I'd spend a lot more time in the Dreaming City. Or if I could focus them from the Shattered Throne in some way, maybe at a kiosk, kind of like at the end of raids, I might actually have a reason to run Shattered Throne. For that matter, please, for the love of God, let me focus world drop weapons from Banshee. We've had some fantastic world drop weapons the last couple of seasons. Weapons like Sire-Matic, the world drop pulse rifle from this season, or Combined Action, the world drop 120 hand cannon from last season. But your chances of getting a good roll on them are slim at best because 1, they don't drop all that often, and 2, Banshee brings them, but he only very rarely has even half-decent rolls of these weapons. Moving on, something that desperately needs to be addressed is, again, abilities, in both PvP and in PvE. Like in PvE, we can talk about power creep on weapons and armor and all that as much as we want, but none of that matters when I can take 5 minutes to copy a build from a YouTube video that makes my weapons completely irrelevant anyway. For that matter, while Checkmate is fantastic, abilities need an uptime and potency reduction in PvP across the board. Maybe not to the same degree as Checkmate, but still a reduction of some sort, especially in uptime and to a lesser degree in potency. Also, there has to be a discussion about certain abilities that are just way too strong and too free for what they are. Obviously, Titans are, of course, the most oppressive here. Barricades do not need to give overshields. In fact, they should not give overshields at all, period. Barricades already offer way too much utility by themselves. Not only do they provide on-demand cover, because they damage opponents who walk through them, they can be used for area denial. You can use them to block off hallways, block off doorways, and the enemy team has to choose between either A, breaking your barricade, which will probably give you enough time to do something like take an objective or whatever, because for some reason, people in this game just do not team shoot barricades, or they try to walk through your barricade, take damage, and get one-tapped. Another example again, Titan Shoulder Charge and Shield Bash style melees are another just perfect example. They already do a tremendous amount of damage. They have tracking more aggressive than a Call of Duty attack dog, and they send you flying. They do not need to suppress, blind, and disorient you either. For that matter, moving on to another class, there's Child of the Old Gods on Voidlock, which slows you, damages you, and weakens you. It's very literally just a mini hunter tether, but with arguably better tracking, and all you have to do to get it is throw down a rift, and all you have to do to deploy it is tag an opponent a couple of times, and that Child of the Old Gods is going to run them down relentlessly. Hunter, I think, in PvP is easily the least oppressive class here as a whole, but even then, Suspend from Strand is basically a free kill. I really think, honestly, if you use like the Strand dive or whatever, it should, give you a much longer cooldown, kind of like Bacchus did with your dodge. The Strand grapple melee is every bit as broken as Titan melees are, and Invis still has way too much uptime and is extremely unfun and frustrating to play against. Something that I've noticed about Checkmate is even with the lack of, consistent special ammo and how annoyingly handholdy it is that it is still way more viable to play aggressively in Checkmate, because when you push, you're not constantly having every ability in the game thrown at you. Now, moving more into the PvE side of things, I really want a reason to run strikes again and to spend more time in the open world parts of the game. As far as strikes go, a great start to this would be bringing back strike-specific loot. Like back in the Forsaken days, we were all grinding Hallowed Lair because we wanted Mindbender's ambition. As far as the open world goes, I would love to have more of a reason to spend time in patrol zones. Like, Destiny's worlds are gorgeous. The art style in this game is some of the best in the entire gaming industry. But spending time in patrol zones, one, it feels kind of like a waste of time, and quite frankly, it's just kind of boring. There's just really not much going on there. One thing that would help patrol zones a lot would be patrol zone specific loot, like again, in Forsaken. A lot of us were spending time in the Tangled Shore because we wanted to get that God Roll Dustrock Blues. Another addition would be world bosses, and I'm not talking like public event bosses, I mean huge MMO-style world bosses that spawn in, pretty much at random and have weapons and armor specific to them. The closest thing we have to this is Vex Strike Force on Neomuna, and it's a great event. It's a lot of fun. But what I'm really looking for is something similar to world bosses in MMOs like Guild Wars 2, where they have a chance to drop, strong weapons, good armor. They take a lot of firepower to take down. They're very strong, and fighting them is just a good time. Like in Guild Wars 2, if I see a world boss spawn nearby, even if that particular boss doesn't have anything that I want, I'm probably going to go help fight it, because the fights are just fun, because you have a whole bunch of players fighting a single, very tough, very strong boss, and it's just, super chaotic, and it's genuinely a lot of fun. That's unironically, one of my favorite parts of Guild Wars 2 are the world bosses. Now, moving on, I could go on about all of this for a long time, and I may do my own video on this in the future, potentially. But the last thing I want to mention is I really would like social spaces to feel like social spaces. Give us LFG inside of social spaces, something like a message board in the tower where you can go and find groups looking for players. Give us areas where we can potentially trade with players as well. Trading would be such a great addition to this game. It's not even funny. Like, me and my fiance will sometimes grind certain encounters in dungeons, and it's just hilarious because they don't play PvP at all. They don't like it. But God knows they always get the best PvP rolls in the game. That's not an exaggeration. And then I'm a PvP main, and I get tons of like PvE god rolls, and being able to trade would make our lives so much easier. Also, give us more variety in social zones. The tower is fine, the tower is great, but variety is never a bad thing. It was nice having both the tower and the Vestian outpost in Destiny 1, just for the sake of, again, making things a little bit different, being able to go different places, find different people, so on and so forth. I would also add just, little things to do in social zones, whether that's, mini games or something of the sort that other players can join in on, that sort of thing. Make them feel social, make them a viable way to find groups and make friends in a game that is so very reliant on having people to play with. Anyway, Cammy, if you watch this, thank you so much for letting me use your video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, please. To everyone else, thank you so much for watching. Motivation to play and make videos has been pretty low with the situation at Bungie this week, but we'll get back in the saddle and have more videos soon. If you enjoyed this video or found it interesting, please do me a favor and leave me a like and a comment. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. For now, I will see you all next time. Peace, Guardians.